Okay, the floor is open.
Is there a legitimacy to attempts to reconcile common accepted scientific ideas and theories with Torah by saying, for example, evolution, and suggesting that it was done by Hashem and fitting in with Sefer Hashem, and similarly with the age of the universe being commonly accepted in the scientific world, fitting it in.
Okay, it's a complex question. Let me break it up into pieces. The first question is, could science prove that there is no God? Could science prove that there is no God? The answer to that question is no, for several reasons. First of all, any proposition that you want to prove, you are responsible for explaining the concepts in the proposition, explaining what the concepts mean. This is a point that's made by the philosopher Peter van Inwagen. And since science has nothing to say about what God means, science can't describe the proposition that's to be examined. Any proof about God has to have, at least part, theology as its basis. Science alone has nothing to say about whether there is or is not a God. That's one problem. The other problem, which you are alluding to, is that whatever science describes, it's always possible that there is a creator behind what it's describing, making it happen, and just not showing his presence. So science's description may, in fact, predict correctly what's going to happen, and the world may behave as if the scientific picture were the whole story. That could be true, but it could still not be the whole story. It could be that God is making it happen behind the scenes. That's true for the age of the universe. That's true for evolution. That's true for anything you like. So that's if you put science up as an attempt to prove there is no God, it certainly cannot do that. Now, let's make it a little more specific. How about science vis-a-vis the Jewish tradition, the Torah? Could we reconcile the Jewish tradition with the contemporary theories and descriptions in science? Don't change anything, leave it all the same, and say that the contemporary theories of science are just describing how things look from the outside. The Torah's description is true because God is making it all happen from the inside. The answer to that question depends crucially on how much you think of when you say the Torah. What constitutes the Torah? How much of the tradition is included in the Torah? Just the verses of the first chapter of Genesis? Is that the whole Torah we're talking about? If that's the whole Torah we're talking about, then maybe the answer is yes. If we use some not too terribly implausible ways of interpreting the verses of Genesis, then maybe that could be true. Maybe what are called days there are really indeterminately long periods, millions or billions of years, because there are difficulties with the word day no matter how you look at it. Some of the order is difficult. Plants appear before the sun is in the skies. What happens to photosynthesis? Well, okay, that's a minor problem. Maybe we can squeeze around it. There was light. It just wasn't the sun, so some kind of light was doing the job, even though, according to the ordinary scientific picture, the sun was there before plants were there, but okay, that's a minor problem. We'll fool around with it. But if you're going to take the rest of the Tanakh and you're going to take the whole of the oral tradition, then it's hopeless. Then it's hopeless. Man cannot possibly be a seemingly, superficially natural product of evolution from earlier life forms. Indeed, whole categories of life are described by the Torah and taken that way by the entirety of the tradition as brand new creations. Not only man, but the animals and the plants. There's a different, independent, divine command calling forth these things, you have to ride roughshod over it and say, well, it wasn't really independent, really natural. It developed naturally by the same laws, but just poetry. And the tradition doesn't take it as poetry. So I think that even a reconciliation, if you're going to talk about reconciling the contemporary picture of the scientific picture of the world, the way the scientists put it, with the Torah's picture, where Torah means the whole of the Jewish tradition, and I think the case is hopeless. In particular, the vast majority of commentators on the first 6 days of Genesis take the days as 6 24-hour periods. So there's no way to cram the scientific picture of real 13.8 billion years into 6 24-hour periods. So something has to be done, and we have ways of doing it. We have ways of modifying the picture in order to make it work, but it will not confirm the contemporary scientific picture the way the scientists understand it. It will not confirm that. So now, one last remark. You asked your question about the attempt to reconcile. Attempts to reconcile are fine. Attempts to reconcile are fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Try it out. Just have the strictest intellectual standards for what counts as a success. A very good primer in this subject, there is a website called Torah Explorer. The author's name is Joram Bogacz, spelled in the Polish way, B-O-G-A-C-Z. And he has a review of a book called Genesis and the Big Bang. And the review is called Genesis and the Big Bluff. It's 100 pages long, where he takes apart that book, page by page. And not only does he take it apart, but he describes in some detail what the right way is to go about such a project. Now that's an article on a website. He published a book called Genesis and Genes, published by Feldheim, where he goes through scientific matters in general, and particular evolution, and explores them in great detail. And at the end, there's a long appendix where he talks about these matters again in terms of the correct methodology for dealing with these types of questions. And I would strongly recommend it to readers. In fact, I have put myself on the line. Anybody who can read Genesis and Genes and tell me honestly that his attitude towards science in general and evolution in particular has not been changed by it, I will give him $100. So far, no one has taken me up on it. Because the majority of people don't read it. Nobody reads books anymore. But those people who do read it find that their attitude has changed. So I heartily recommend it.
I just would want to understand, first of all, is it possible for somebody of my low level of, Torah knowledge, like I don't have the in-depth clarity, to start understanding and to start seeing in general, oh, this makes sense that this would be getting us closer to Hashem in this way of doing, and that not, and if so, what are some of the ways?
I think the best way to answer your question is to try it out. And here's how you try it out. Take a case and think it through and figure out what seems to you to be a good way to get close to Hashem, and then look at the literature. See, number one, if it's contradicted somewhere. Then see if nobody mentions it. If nobody mentions it, that's very suspicious. We have a very big literature, very wide literature. And I don't mean that you have to do literature search by yourself. You can ask knowledgeable people. And you could try out your intuition, try it out, let's say 20 times, and see how many times you get it right. I think I told you, maybe I didn't tell you, this group, one of my intuitions, when I was becoming frum, and I said, since steak and potatoes is a wonderful, filling, glorious supper, and according to the halacha, you should make a one-liner when it's finished, bread nefashos, and one slice of bread gets the whole of benching, and it seemed to me that was a little bit imbalanced. So I resolved that every time I have steak and potatoes, I'll have a slice of bread, and then I'll bench. Now, according to the Shulchan Aruch, I'm benching on the bread. I don't have to bench on the bread. Any problem with that? I was very proud of myself for thinking of that. When I spoke to my Rabbi about it, he said, no. Because according to your intuition, the halacha is imbalanced. Go back and study the sources and find out why the halacha is right. So I used my intuition, I tested it out, and it was wrong. If you use your intuition and test it out and it turns out to be wrong a good percentage of the time, then you learn not to trust your intuition. And then you say, well, if I want to figure out what will make this particular practice more spiritual, then I better look and read what the people who are great spiritual guides have said about how to do this.
Well, I'm already think being smart enough to not trust fully my intuition. That's why I'm asking somebody else. So, but I don't mean like...
But that's what you asked. You asked, what about figuring out for myself what will make it more spiritual?
Right, so what I mean is not so much like, can I see if I do know? Is there a way to learn how to do it?
Sure, you build your intuition.
By seeing, matching it up, and...
That's right, and eventually when you have, it's just like when you're learning Gemara, and you think of a kasha, and then you see the Ritva ask that kasha, you say, wow, I asked the Ritva's kasha. Now that happens to you over and over again. You say, well, okay, I'm getting pretty good. When I have an intuition about a Gemara, I'm getting pretty good. And the most wonderful success is when something just doesn't work, and you look in the back of the Rashash, and he says the text is wrong. Oh, wow. There's no solution. There's no way out. I didn't make a mistake. The text is wrong. The text has to be amended. So, Baruch Hashem, I didn't make a stupid mistake. The more that happens, the more you learn to trust your intuition. In my case, it took me decades to get to that point. I now have that wonderful experience quite often. But it takes a long, long time to beat your intuitions into shape.
I guess I was more erring on the side of wishful thinking. Like, is there like a key, so to speak? Like,
yeah, that I don't know. There are things that you can put into words, and then there are things that you can't put into words. Obviously, you can't put everything into words because at some point the words give out. There's only a finite number of words. You can't define everything in more words. Some things you just understand. And indeed, there are many things about life that you understand without words. Very often we find ourselves searching for words. How can I express that? How can I put that? Somebody asks you, how do you know? How do I know? Intuition. I just know. We ask a chess master. How did you know to make that move? Very often he'll say, if you look at the board and you see how it's built, this side, that side, then you know that this is what you have to do. He knows, and he's right because he wins his games, but he can't put into words how he knows. He can't say it. In mathematics, we have a proof that has to be so. It's called Gödel's theorem. So that it's impossible to have words to describe the way to solve every problem. So the key is something which you pick up.
What's the name of that theory? Gödel's theory?
Godel is the name of the person who proved it. Gödel. It's with two dots over the O. It's a German name. Kurt Gödel. Godel. Gödel's theorem. I wrote my PhD thesis on that theorem. So there are certain things which you learn by watching people do them and trying to do them, and then you catch on or you don't catch on. Suppose somebody's starting out in Gemara. Now you've learned some Gemara. Sometimes the other way says, "Can you just give me a key to asking a good kasha? Just explain to me, how do you ask a good kasha?" What will you tell them? Learn it up 25 times. Make sure, and then think: is it logical or isn't it logical? And then you'll come up with a good kasha, which isn't much help, right?
The more you get close to Hashem, the more you practice trying to figure out how you get close to Hashem, the more you know how to get close to Hashem.
And you test that by testing it against the given sources and see how often you get it right. Yeah, what else is on people's minds?
With regard to the mitzvahs, it seems that men have one mitzvah, which is learning Torah, which is like the number one, which is something that if they have nothing to do and they're like, what should I do now? Then like that's the first choice. So my question is there anything that women have similar to that? If they're, for example, the kids are out of the house, they've got a lot of free time, how do they choose to do what to do? Is there one thing? And if not, how do they know, what they do? We also saw them say to them, what I'm saying?
It's a very good question. I'm not aware that there's any rule that tells them what to do when there's nothing else to do. Obviously, it should be mitzvah because we weren't put in the world to do nothing. But I remember someone, I don't remember who, making the observation that this is true in general in women's lives, much more so than in men's lives. For example, at a young age, the primary responsibility for raising children falls on the woman, right? Any rules? How to bring up children? How much corporal punishment? How much shaming? How much reinforcement to give? Apparently, a great deal more is left to women's intuition. And by the way, intuition is another form for knowledge. It's not superstition. than to men. Men's lives are run by rules, and women's lives, to a large extent, are not run by rules. Now, there is a general thought that my capacity to be good at doing mitzvahs isn't equal. If I find it very difficult to read other people's emotions or attitudes, I don't know what other people are thinking or feeling. But I'm a whiz with numbers, and I have extra free time. Maybe I should offer to do the books of the yeshiva rather than interview prospective students, because as big students, I'm going to ruin the student body of the yeshiva. And if I do the books, I'm going to be doing them a great favor. So one thing to take into account is that a mitzvah where you can have a bigger impact on the welfare of the Jewish community, that would be a better place to invest your efforts. The other thing, which Rav Esther points out, I think he took it from the Gra, and further back, things that are difficult for you in Ruchnius, in spirituality, are probably primary for you. Although many will counsel that you should start with the things that are easy and build up your self-confidence and build up your strength and so on and so on, but your primary purpose of being in the world is to conquer the things that are difficult. Where did he take that from? There was a source for that. I can't remember. But that was what it was a test. So that criteria would apply to a woman just as much as a man. If you find some inner resistance against a certain type of mitzvah, or doing well at a certain type of mitzvah, then that would be a place to put extra effort. But you're right. For a man, it's legislated. Right. And by the way, saying that Torah study is primary is a very, I would say, dangerous way to put it, because it isn't as if there's a single scale of priority with some higher and some lower. There are many different competing scales of priority, and making an overall judgment of what's primary, I think, is impossible. I think it's too subtle. For example, you're learning, and there's a mitzvah to be done, and you are the only person who's capable of doing that mitzvah. So what is the rule? You have to stop learning to do that mitzvah. But why? If learning's primary, whatever that other mitzvah is secondary. Why would you stop doing a primary for the sake of a secondary? So then, in terms of conflict, Torah is bottom of the list. Torah is bottom of the list. Any other mitzvah that needs to be done by you takes precedence over Torah. So is Torah primary or secondary? Well, in terms of something about its impact is primary. In terms of competition with others, it's secondary. And there are others on the list as well. Talk about the punishment for not carrying it out. Right? The punishment for eating a cheeseburger is much stricter than the punishment for not learning. Right? I mean, so in terms of punishment, it's a third hierarchy. It's a very complicated system. It's not a system that easily lends itself to a simple judgment of what's primary and what's secondary.
So I guess a follow-up to that, I'm not really sure how much it has to do, but I learned that Hashem a number of times, and for some reason it stuck out for me that he never mentioned like women and what their role is. And especially when it came to where he talks about learning Torah and how special it is, there I felt like you're not differentiating. Like you're just saying it as if it refers to everyone. I always assumed when he talks about like Adam and man that, that can refer to everyone. Everyone's point is to get close to God, and everyone's point is, When it came to that, also it was like he refers to Adam's sin a lot. I don't know. Is that
you're right. I don't.
For some strange reason, I felt like he was putting the whole world together in one humongous picture. And every time I read it, I felt like he left something out.
Yeah, I think he does talk about the difference between mitzvah osa and mitzvah osa. Whether you're absolutely commanded to do something, or whether you're just invited to do something, or offered a reward, but you don't have to do it. Now, take that together with the fact that for women, at least the general obligation of learning Torah is what's called Ein mitzvah osa. So then he's already covered that by implication. It's covered by implication. But you're right. He says nothing. In fact, I'm thinking about his other sforim. That's an interesting observation. I don't remember anywhere that he talks about the nature or the role of women at all, anywhere. I've learned a number of his sforim, some of them number of times. I can't think of a single place where he talks about.
I just was curious. You said last time that you also talked about Truma, correct? So I just wanted to know someone with such background that I learned that philosophy and all this stuff. How does someone come to become about Truma, and what point of time, what changed?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is all on my website, so it's all there in great detail. Very briefly, I was a philosopher before I knew what the word meant. I always wanted to know why things should be the way they were. I could not make my peace with any of the other disciplines because they all have axioms. We assume this and go forward. And I always wanted to know, why are you assuming that? And they said, don't ask that question, just take it and go. Axioms, mathematics, the scientific method, whatever you like. Observation, why do you trust observation? What makes observation so important? That's how we do it. We do observations, and we go on from there. That's why I was philosophical in my guts before I even knew what the word meant. I started my investigation of Yiddishkeit when I was an undergraduate, and I was studying philosophy and math at the time, and taking courses in Jewish subjects from professors who were anti-religious, so it was very confusing. I loved every minute of it. There's all these streams of information, all the contradictions. Go to this side and ask them what they say about that side, go back to that side and give them the answers, and go back and forth, back and forth. Investigation took 2.5 years. After that period of time, I was convinced that the vast majority of reason is on the side of traditional Judaism. I took off a year after my BA and came to Merkaz Rav Kook. I spent a year in Merkaz Rav Kook. Then I went back and got my doctorate and went to Johns Hopkins to teach. All the time continuing my Jewish education, part-time, like everybody does. You work, and when you have spare time, you do the best you can to learn with it. I taught at Johns Hopkins as a professor of philosophy, all the time learning and growing and developing. Then I came to Eretz Yisrael, to Or Sameach, and they did me a great charity, a great benefit. First year, I only taught at night. So I had 2 full storim in the day to learn. And I spent the year with Tzvi Kushelevsky, who tore my brain to shreds. He tore it to shreds. He's an outstanding genius, an outstanding Talmid Chacham. And after about 6 months in total darkness, I had no idea what was going on. Little by little, the darkness started to clear and became gray. By the end, I more or less figured out what was going on. It was a great year. Great year, great leap forward. And I spent 2 years in the morning in the mirror with wonderful Chavrusa, who was across the street. And after that, I learn every morning in the Boston Kollel, and I teach here in the afternoons and the evenings. So the growth in terms of philosophy and Yiddishkeit was simultaneous. The initial foundation was laid in my undergraduate years. And I must say, there are difficulties. Chief among them, my area of philosophy was philosophy of mathematics, logic. I found Gemara very hard because in my field, there's a certain method of doing things. And because I was invested in my field, I trusted it, and I wasn't bad at it. But it's utterly wrong for Gemara. For example, in mathematics, logic, philosophy of mathematics, you start with a few primitive concepts, and anything you want to talk about has to be defined in terms of those concepts. You want to talk about something that isn't one of the few given primitive concepts, the first question is to define it. If you can't define it, we don't talk about it. Well, Gemara is not like that at all. I remember sitting in a shir. The teacher of the shir was Shlomo Sternberg. Shlomo Sternberg was, and may still be, a professor of mathematics at Harvard. He was the youngest person ever to get full professorship at Harvard. He was an unbelievable genius and a frum Jew. He was teaching the Dorim, and he mentioned This is an Isser Hefza, this is Isser Gavra. And I said, how do you define those terms? And he said, we don't, and just kept going. I almost fainted. And he's a mathematician. You don't define them? You don't define them? You just keep going when you don't have a definition? I mean, how do you do that? Answer. The Gemara is much more like empirical science, much more like theoretical empirical science. A definition of the key concepts is at the end of the rainbow. When you're finished with all the analysis and you can explain everything, then you have an adequate definition. Before that, you don't have adequate definitions. You're changing the definitions all the time. New experiment is done, shows the old definition is wrong, you got to change it for a new definition. Getting a definition is the goal of the study, not the starting point of the study. And if you learn Gemara, you're doing that all the time. You learn Chesed Sabatim. 30 daf of certain types of case law, of property transfer, and ownership. You talk about what is a chazaka. Every daf you change the definition because you had a new case. New case came out in another way, and they say, well, to accommodate this case, I got to change the definition that way. You're changing the definitions all the way around. It took me years to learn that mental set that was not natural to me because I was trained in a different field. So that was something which was a big challenge. So there are ways in which the two, especially my area of philosophy, was problematic. So, like anything else, Aristotle said every field has its own logic. Every field has its own conceptual structure. Every field has its own mode of evidence. There's no such thing as a royal road to logic. You learn the logic of a field by diving into the field and making 1,000 mistakes and then catching on, like we said before. We're not catching on and then driving buses or something. And I dove in and did the best I could to swim.
And according to your opinion, do you think that a lot of people in the college are more atheists? Is that what like more they teach?
They definitely are more atheists, but I'll tell you, in my experience, when I went to college, I was an atheist also. If you ask me, have you read any books on atheism? What you believe in? The answer is no. Have you read a book on theism? Thing you don't believe in? The answer is no. So why are you an atheist? Because everybody else is an atheist. And why is everybody else atheist? Because they're angry at their parents and they want freedom. They don't want to be told what to do. There's no God, there's no absolute morality, and I'll do as I please. It's all psychological, social, adolescent, certainly not worthy of great respect, and it's trivial. And the professors who trumpet themselves as atheists, I would ask them the same question. How many books on theism have you read, studied, could explain? How many books on atheism have you read? Give me an account of a well-accepted theistic argument and your critical observations that it's not correct. The people who call themselves the new atheists, who are professors, have written the most foolish, silly, obviously incorrect stuff because they're not trained in religion or theology. Some are mere scientists, I say that on purpose, and some are philosophers who ought to know better, but none of them has any footnotes to the religious tradition. They're just trumpeting their atheism. Well, they're trumpeting their incompetence. Some of the more thoughtful atheist philosophers have pointed out the mistakes in the arguments that they have put forward, and they're just obvious, the mistakes. So, yes, they are atheists, but it's the default, unthinking, herd instinct position of the left, and they're no less guilty of herd instinct thinking than anybody else is. By the way, the remarks that I made at the beginning in answer to his question, if science can't prove that there is no God, you can't use science to back up your observation that there is no God. But everyone will tell you that. Science has proved there is no God, and so therefore there's nothing to talk about. It's just, so you're right, the vast majority are. Look, I went to university in the 60s. Of course, the universities were very far left at that time as well. And I started out as a flaming liberal, bordering on radical, like almost all the other students. There's this overworn cliche. If you're 20 and you're not a liberal, you have no heart. And if you're 30 and you're still a liberal, you have no brain. The present Boston Rebbe of Yerushalayim, Har Nof, was the one who gave me the first jolt. I said to him, Everyone is born equal and the same. It's only your environment that makes you different. There are no difference between Jews and non-Jews, or men and women. It's just a question of how you're brought up, how you're taught, and how you're raised, because that's what they taught us, the liberal gospel. He said to me, "Oh, what's your evidence for that?" I said, "Evidence?" "Yeah," he said. "What's your evidence for saying that?" And I thought, hey, nobody ever gave me any evidence. Nobody ever offered any evidence. So then, how come they're all trumpeting it from the housetops? How come it's absolutely obligatory belief for everybody in the club if there's no evidence for it? Then I began to get suspicious. Come on. You're supposed to be intellectuals, smarter than everybody else, better educated, more rational than everybody else, and you hold such a substantive position without evidence? Then I did a little research and I found out the nature-nurture debate, and every 15 years it swings back this way and that way, and the twin studies with identical twins and the contributions of genes going back and forth every 10, 15 years. There's very little evidence to push it one way or the other, very little. Some of it suggestive on the other side. So I began to become very suspicious, and I am what's called a repentant liberal. That is to say, I once was liberal and I've repented of that. And I think I know better now than to do that. But the fact that they are, I have a motto: don't count people, count reasons. And don't assume that intelligent people have reasons. Ask them for their reasons. 1 billion people with one reason count for one. One person with 3 reasons counts for 3. Ask them, what are your reasons? And when you do that, you'll find out that there are very few. All these educated people, there are very few. And they believe in self-serving positions for which there's no evidence or rafts of counter-evidence, and they just dismiss it like biblical criticism, which is, as a theory, is atrocious. And yet the academia pledges allegiance to it because it serves their purposes. The evolution debate is also atrocious from the point of view of someone who knows philosophy of science. The amount of prejudice, name-calling, trumpeted irrationality. Someone wrote a book, and the reviewers from the evolution side, the reviewer wrote, "This book is awful. It's full of prejudice and mistakes and poor logic, and it's so bad I didn't read it." He writes that, and he doesn't realize how ridiculous that makes him sound to any reasonable person. It's so bad I didn't read it. Give me a break. This is where the state of debate is in evolution, where one side systematically mischaracterizes the other side, and they say year after year after year, hundreds of times, this is what we believe in, and the other side says, you believe in something else, and they keep talking like that as if they can't read, or they don't listen, or don't think. I mean, you get used to that, and you see that there's a lot of unthinking what's going on. And the crucial a crucial principle in this whole discussion is be very careful to check what is the expertise of the person who's speaking, and only trust him within his expertise. I don't say always trust him, but only trust him within his expertise. The minute he steps outside his expertise, he has no longer any authority. I write things about science. I don't write to myself. I'm not a scientist. All the things I write and speak about science, I take from outstanding scientists. There's one fellow, when I want to name, I have something about names. When I want to name it, it escapes me. He's an Israeli fellow, a very eminent applied scientist. He's authored 400 papers, and he is the author and the editor of 17 books. And he wrote against me that I didn't know what I was talking about. So I sent him a quotation from Stephen Weinberg, a quotation from Stephen Hawking, and a quotation from Brian Greene, 3 outstanding theoretical scientists, all of whom backed up what I said, because I didn't take it from my own stuff. I took it from it, right? And I sent it to him. No answer. Why? Because he's an applied scientist. And he's trying to write about theoretical science. It's outside his expertise. It's outside his expertise, and he can't be trusted for that. So don't ever trust the person outside his expertise. That's why I do my best to be careful that whenever I write outside the area of philosophy, then I quote people who are experts in the field. In philosophy, I earned a PhD, I published research papers, I published a book with Oxford University Press, so I think that I have the right to offer my opinion about things in philosophy. I also read the top philosophers as well. It's not as if I do it only on my own. But be very, very wary of people speaking outside their expertise. In particular, scientists are not experts in philosophy of science. That may sound crazy. How can you be a good philosopher without knowing the principles of what you do? But it is very possible. Mathematicians are not philosophers of mathematics either. It's a little bit like the difference between being a superb athlete and a superb coach. Obviously, a superb coach might not himself be a superb athlete. And it's also true that not every superb athlete is good at training at other athletes. He may not have the ability to do that. He just does what he does and does it very well. So a little bit like that difference, the difference between science and philosophy of science, and the fact that a person is a great scientist does not mean that he can talk about philosophy of science. Stephen Hawking makes ridiculous remarks about philosophy of science all the time. And it isn't because he's a scientist. Very rarely do you have a scientist who's good in philosophy of science, like Roger Penrose, who is really excellent at both. But it's very rare.
And in college, the professors themselves, they're like liberals, leftists?
Yes, the vast majority are leftists.
Because it says after 30, usually you change your status.
Oh, no. I did, but again, it says the motto says, if at 20 you're not a liberal, you have no heart, and if at 30 you're still a liberal, you have no brain. And they qualify for the second half. They definitely qualify for the second half. And again, ask someone in economics, ask someone in psychology, ask someone in Egyptian history, and so forth and so on. You're a liberal, give me a reasoned defense of liberalism. He can't do it. He can't do it. So he's a liberal by default. That's all. It's a style. Why are all the journalists liberals? Same thing. It's a fault. Journalists, right? The media are in the hands of liberals. Why it's that way ultimately, I don't know. It's a self-perpetuating club. I'll tell you an interesting story. Many universities have funds for minorities because minorities are under psychological pressure and they want to give them ability to organize. They give them funds for clubs. And they're minority clubs of various types. Of course, you have to define minority in a funny way. Women are minorities. Yeah, even though the majority of the campus is women, but women count as minority. Okay. And Jews are never a minority. They don't get any help, right? But okay, leave that aside. At Tufts University, one group was a very small group, asked for funds. Something like 8% of the faculty belonged to this particular type of group. And something like 5% of the students belonged, so they applied for minority status. They were denied. You know what group that was? Political conservatives. Well, they're a very distinct minority, and they're being criticized and degraded all the time. What happened to that? No, we don't give it to conservatives. Excuse me. That's not, it's not on the schedule. Because we do it for only the ones that liberals approve of, or lefties approve of. I mean, it's, in that respect, it's, and now, this business of sensitivity. The judge of whether you said something insensitive is whether the other person says that it hurts. So that's it. You have now shut down, I mean, it's been bad for years and years, but it's getting even worse now. It's free speech has disappeared. It's under, because if you say something and somebody says, you've hurt me, that's it. You're going to be thrown out. What happened to discussing things? There's a wonderful book called Illiberal Education. There was another book on the, I forget what the name of the second book. There was an incident at the University of Michigan where someone said in a psychology class, he said the following words: I believe that sexual orientation can be changed through psychotherapy. They censured him and they said, if you make another remark like that, we'll throw you out of school. Why? Because a homosexual whom the society regards as abnormal will take it now as a critique of him that he doesn't use psychotherapy to change, and therefore you're hurting him, and therefore you can't say it. So what can you discuss? You know, what kinds of issues are open for free discussion? That's where it's holding. Yeah. Yeah.
Quick. It's just like a quick. I think so, but I don't know. Do you put Isaac Asimov under that same out of his field, just spouting, not actual just spouting, but some like very large erroneous statements?
No. There's a field called science writing. There are science writers who themselves are not research scientists, and they don't report on their own scientific ideas. They report on other people's scientific ideas. And that is a genuine field. And of course, there are better or worse people in any field. But the fact that a person sets himself out to explain science to the world and reads all the research science and then organizes and presents it in an understandable way, that's a wonderful profession. And there are very good people doing that. Isaac Asimov was a genius in doing that. He was, by the way, Richard Dawkins, of whom you may have heard. What most people don't know, his chair at Oxford was a chair in the public understanding of science. He was not a research scientist. That may excuse some of his many errors. Probably doesn't excuse some of the others. But that's definitely a legitimate field. I read the best people, the best science writers are people who themselves are research scientists and who write for the lay public as well. Those are the books that I try to read, insofar as they exist. Brian Greene is a leading researcher in string theory, and he has written 3 major books for the lay public, and I've read all of them. I'm just reading now Caleb Scharf, who's the head of the astronomy section at Columbia University, and he himself is a leading researcher, and he's writing about the Copernicus complex, which is the book that I'm in the middle of now. But sometimes there's a woman named, she just wrote a book called Junk DNA, Nessa Carey, I think her name is, British. She herself has a PhD in science, and she worked in industry in science. She's not a leading researcher, but she worked in industry, so she knows the science well. And she read the whole literature. There's hundreds of footnotes to the literature, and she explains what has been discovered. So I take her to be a well-informed and competent person to review the literature and to explain to us who are not otherwise fluent in that field what's going on in that field. So science writing is a perfectly good, and Isaac Asimov really was a master of the field. I think he wrote something like 900 books or something. I read him as a child all the time, both the science fiction, some of which was prophetic, and a lot of what he wrote about science and mathematics. I learned a great deal from him.
You said prophetic, right?
Some of the science, yeah.
Yeah, good. Like his population control ideas and things.
That I don't remember. I remember we wrote about physics. I remember we wrote about robotics.
And one of the things he said basically happened, and it's like such a large-scale idea that, like, it's like the whole world turning on its ear kind of thing, and happened, and it saved, and
I can tell you that the people who have tried this kind of prediction, Paul Ehrlich, who did it twice with 2 different books, and both books' predictions turned out to be dead wrong. And the result was that Obama took him to be the head of his Council of Scientific Advisors, and okay, so those are the lefties. Those are the lefties.
With regard to the way we look at death of people and of the world, to take us back to the state before sin, I guess to correct whatever changes that happen. So my question is there a reason why there has to be a whole process? Like, in other words, there's a whole death and then waiting period. And then with regard to the world, it has to be like 1,000 years of destruction. Is there a reason why it has to be a whole, I guess, chalois, a whole event, rather than God just spontaneously changing his back? And I know, like, when Kyle discusses, like, there's a lot of steps with regard to the world, especially, like the way we, like, he gets rid of, like, he sort of makes us much more spiritual, like, the way, like, first we end up, I don't know exactly, like the physical ends up being, like, only partly, and that ends up only being a memory, like, there's always steps, like, a whole process.
Okay, if you're asking why things happen in multi-step processes rather than just all at once, Ramchal has a general explanation of that. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, in some sense or other, infinite. his reality completely transcends what we are. If he would do things in the world on the basis of his total reality, we would understand nothing. That could be. We would just live in a random world where nothing made sense. He didn't want that. He wanted a relationship of mutual understanding. Now, like when you have a child, in Yis Hashem you will have children, and your 4-year-old will ask you, why, when I press the button, does the light go on? You think, what am I going to do? Talk to them about atoms with free electrons, an electron source, electron sink, and so on. Electricity is something that goes through a wire, and there are wires, and when it goes, and the button lets it go through, when it goes through to the light shines. That's not exactly correct. It leads to certain false pictures. James Thurber, one of the noted writers of the 20th century, reported that his mother would never leave a light socket without a light in it, because she was afraid that if the light socket had no light bulb in it, and somebody turned on the switch, the electricity would leak into the room. Because it's going through the wire. Now, where's it going to go when it gets to that end? There's nothing taking it further on. So it's going to leak into the room. Well, that's what you get. If you say that electricity flows through the wire, that's a natural association. So, okay, but you're talking to a 4-year-old. So you boil it down. So what did the Baruch Hu do? He created our minds to work in a certain way. And then, so to speak, he resolved most of the time to behave in a way that our minds will be able to understand. That's so as to be able to create a mind-to-mind relationship. And therefore, everything is done in terms of principles and steps, and this idea of intermediary steps in all of his writings. Wherever an intermediary step is possible, he puts it in, so that there'll be no jumps, or at least as few jumps as possible. Now, having said that, he also, I should tell you, just as a footnote, and I don't think I'm speaking out of my own prejudice because other people who are not like me agree with me, Ramchal basically, fundamentally, is a philosopher. If you want to know what he is, he's a philosopher. He applied his thought to, but his mode of thinking, his interests, the kinds of questions that he asks are philosophical across the board. And he has a sense of the philosophical advantages or propriety of one system over another. And here's one of the things that he says, I forget where he says this. In order to do anything, we have to have free will. The only way we can be responsible for what we do is we have to have free will. Okay, so the first thing is, create a world where human beings have free will. Now, what should they do with their free will? I don't know. Anything you like. Jump through hoops, weave baskets, do something and then be judged on what they do. Ramchal says, no, Akash Baruch Hu didn't do it that way. Akash Baruch Hu used only one principle twice. The first principle is, in order for there to be free will, he has to hide, because his presence will overwhelm any choice that a person will make. So he has to hide his presence. Now, what do you do with your free will? Reveal his presence where it's hiding. So hiddenness, it becomes the single principle of the whole. And he says, anybody who has a taste for, for logical thinking will say, yes, yes, one principle, not two, one. So I thought to myself, yes, that's what a philosopher says, make it as economical as possible. Another person wouldn't care about that. So that part, he says in several places that this is the idea. The idea is he wants to have a relationship of understanding. He created our minds with a certain pattern of understanding. You have it in the Derech Malchus Da'ara, Malchus Da'ara. The judgment system in heaven is a mirror image of the judgment system here. Why? Who judges on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Doesn't he know in January what we're doing? Can't he make an evaluation in January? Sure he can, but I can't live with constant judgment. It's not something that I as a human being am wired to be able to deal with. So he said, no, I won't do it that way. I'll deal with you in the way that I wired you to be able to understand. That's why he does it that way.
Is there a basis for I heard a lot of times, I'm just very curious about the statement that women and men have obviously different tests, and women are created more as a, so to speak, a perfect creation, and their job is to stay like wholesome or of that sort, and men are created with much more chesronos, and that's why they can get up to a higher level, and their job is to perfect themselves.
Okay, I think there's a grain of truth in what you say, but I wouldn't put it exactly that way. I wouldn't say that they're created more perfect, but I would say that if you talk about the range of variation, let's say, I'm just using round numbers without any particular reason for the particular choices, but if a man can vary from minus 100 to plus 100, a woman can vary from minus 50 to plus 50. It's not that she's more perfect. Maybe we'll all start at 0 and can go up and down. But the range of variation for a man is greater than the range of variation for a woman.
So what does that mean? That she just has less potential? Women have less potential, end story? If you have less of a range, you have less to change, you have less of... Our idea is to change.
Yeah, but less to change may be completely insignificant. Suppose you say to the Emerson Vase really talks about this, and he comes out on the other side. But suppose you say to a Rosh Yeshiva, you're really missing out. You're missing out. All you're doing is Talmud Torah. Look at the farmer. Farmer has dozens of mitzvos that he has to do. Dozens of different mitzvos. You're not doing that. You're only doing one thing all day long, right? He's doing much better than you are. You're a Johnny One Note. How many of the Taryag mitzvahs does he do? Lots and lots, and you don't. Right? I don't think the Rosh Yeshiva will be impressed. I don't think he's going to feel like a second-class citizen. The question is not how many different things I do. The question is, how much of an effort do I have to make to do anything at all? What is my potential and what is my contribution? And it may be as hard for a woman to go from 0 to 50 as it is for a man to go from 0 to 100. A man has more things to do and a bigger variation. Doesn't mean he gets a bigger reward. Doesn't mean God loves him more. It's just a formal picture of what his options are.
That means in truth, really, the way from a true Jewish understanding, the woman really has the same range, because it's how much you put into it. Meaning if it takes you much more effort to change a midah, then you really changed much more, and therefore you are, again, on this range of 0 to 100.
No, they're just changing the nature of the range. Right? The range was how many different things do you have to do?
I don't say anything about how many.
You did. You talked about having more chesronos. You said that a man has more chesronos, and therefore he can reach a higher level. Those are your words. I'm quoting you now. You said a man has more chesronos to reach a higher level. That may be true in terms of the range of variation, but it may say nothing about his merit. Because a person may have more merit for changing one than another person has for changing a dozen. Depends upon how much difficulty there is in the changes. The number of changes.
More chesronos, I made a mistake. I mean more. A man is more chaser.
That won't help. The question is, if he's more chaser, that just means that he starts off lower down in the scale, and therefore he can get higher up in the scale. So a farmer will say, I started down with the challenge of unfulfilled dozen mitzvahs, and now I've got the success of a dozen mitzvahs, and you've got only one. But that doesn't make the Rosh Yeshiva less.
True? Is that true that women have started off with less chaser, and it's just that they have to work on they have to work harder on safety?
Well, they have less things to do. There are less mitzvahs that they're required to do.
And does that reflect on their not just the fact that it happens to be their mitzvah, but that reflects on their very nature?
I think it does. They have a mitzvah. They have a bracha. They say in the morning, Shasani Kirtzono, and we don't say that. Shasani Kirtzono is quite a strong statement. He made me according to his will, and a man doesn't say that. So there's got to be something in a woman's very nature that automatically is according to Hashem's will, and a man doesn't have that. Bina Yisera Nitna Leisha Chazal say women get an extra measure of this, whatever intellectual quality Bina is, an extra measure above men. She's given that. So she has more to work with than a man has to work with, which means, as I said before, a man's potential variation is much wider, both on the negative and positive side. But in terms of what you earn and the merit for what you get in your place of Olam Haba, none of that has anything to do with it. That's just a variety in the number of activities that you're involved in. And again, I recommend to you the comparison between a Rosh Yeshiva and a farmer. Okay, I've got to go because I have to teach upstairs.